Greetings all. Dr. Raphael X here with a special guest, my friend Dr. Victor Salas, a fellow Suarez. And before anything else, let us begin with the sign of the cross, as we always do. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, remembering our baptism. So please subscribe to this channel. Click on the like button, leave a comment, share this video, all that good stuff. So today we're here talking about Francisco Suarez. But before anything else, I do want to, for those who don't know Dr. Salas, I want to introduce him. If you can, well, first of all, thanks for coming on. I would like if you could briefly talk about yourself, your work, what's your passions, your hobbies. You can give a little intro to yourself. That would be great.
Sure. So let's see. Well, I'm a professor of philosophy presently at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. I focus primarily, I would say, on scholastic metaphysics, and obviously Suarez is a great interest of mine. I completed my PhD at St. Louis University under the direction of John Doyle, who probably many people know, was an important scholar in late scholasticism, but especially Suarez. So my primary interest, my early interest, I should say, was the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas, but through Doyle, I became familiar with Suarez, and gradually, bit by bit over time, it kind of took over. So yeah, I've been here at Sacred Heart now for, I think I've just completed my 17th year, and have four kids who are now all teenagers. So pray for me. And it's just a busy time, and so between that and teaching and writing, yeah, it keeps me pretty busy.
Yeah, no, is that the seminary where the seminarians or the priests that come from that seminary they become bishops? Is that the famous seminary?
I I don't know about that. I mean,
I've heard good things
some of
about
them
that
have.
seminary.
Yeah, some of them have.
All right. All right, very good. So today we're going to talk about a little bit of epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge, and really the theological orientation of Francisco Suarez metaphysics, which you wrote in a very interesting work here. Uh, as you can see, I marked it up. I should have did it digitally, so I don't have to keep looking down, but I did
That's
use
okay.
it a lot on my PhD thesis, which is published. You guys can purchase this. This is called True Catholic Doctrinal Development and the Modal Distinction of Francisco Suarez. Long title, but I do use his work in my PhD thesis on Suarez. So the question is, with Suarez, it's interesting, and he's doing something right because it does seem that he's getting attacked from both sides. Some
Hmm.
people say that, which you really, I think you do allude to. There's one extreme that says Suarez does not distinguish between philosophy and theology. Like it's indistinguishable. Because right from the
Hmm.
beginning, he says theologians must be metaphysicians. To be a
Hmm.
true theologian, you have to be a metaphysician, right at the introduction. But a lot of the accusations that he has secularized metaphysics.
Hmm.
So it's like,
Hmm.
wait a minute, these are attacks. And again, this shows that your position is sound in a sense if you're being attacked from opposite angles. So what you criticize the other extreme that his metaphysics is doesn't have a theological framework, but that
Hmm.
he has secularized metaphysics. Can you talk a little bit about that or some of the accusations against Suarez regarding that?
Right. And so as I mentioned, my initial interests were in Thomas Aquinas, and so someone like Etienne Gilson was an important scholar for me, and I remember reading his Being and Some Philosophers. And in that text, he's kind of trying to figure out, okay, so when did medieval scholasticism end and early modernity begin? And he points to Suarez, of course, because with Suarez, we seem to have the first stand-alone textbook, if you will, in metaphysics, namely the Disputationes Metaphysicae. So Gilson says, well, it seems as though, with this text, the Disputationes Metaphysicae, this is where you have a metaphysics that's completely emancipated from any kind of theological, context. And thus this is the inauguration of a truly kind of early modern sort of project. And if we recall other thinkers, such as Thomas Aquinas or Duns Scotus, Bonaventure, I mean, these were obviously theologians, but none of them really authored a kind of standalone metaphysical text, right? So The accusation then is that it seems as though Suarez is the inaugurator of all of this, and there are a number of other people as well following along this kind of train of thought. John Milbank seems to try to be one of these people who, develops this narrative of the decline of scholasticism and the beginning of secularity. And he locates that with Duns Scotus, but of course, Suarez plays a role in that as well, to his mind. And this has seemed to have, attracted a lot of attention that just, well, when you look at this standalone text, it's kind of standalone, just like, someone like Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy or Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And so, wittingly or not, this is where early modernity got its start. And I think that that's not an entirely accurate understanding of what Suarez is up to, because as you note, right, in the Disputationes Metaphysicae, he opens that precisely with a reference to, well, this is for the purpose of theologians, right? And you can't be a polished, accomplished theologian without some kind of metaphysical basis, without some kind of metaphysical understanding. And in fact, it was the case that he interrupted his theological project, right? As he noted, he was commenting on Thomas's Summa Theologiae, which is the practice of a theologian, right? He interrupted that work in order to kind of put this metaphysical work out there for the benefit of theologians. So I think when you look at what Suarez, how he himself is framing the text, it's located within a larger theological project. And in fact, many of the decisions that he makes, metaphysical decisions within the Disputationes, are directed and guided by theological commitments, right? So our theological commitments can help inform us with respect to our metaphysical doctrines. And so it's not just this kind of um, radically autonomous, secularized metaphysics that so many people think that it is. And I think it's a healthy balance between both the philosophy and theology.
Yeah, that's so can we see that Suarez in a sense is a precursor of, I don't want to say modern philosophy, but at least in the method, because it was unheard of to have in scholastic times like your own independent metaphysical treatise. So in
Hmm.
that sense, it is a novelty, which is, I don't know why that's seen as a negative. I guess that's associated, as you alluded to Descartes, who
Yeah.
really kind of made it his own independent treatise. But I don't know why. But there is that other danger of everyone thinking they're a type of Suarez, to say, and you
Mhm.
do see this proliferation in modern philosophy, where it's like, oh, let me just write my own
Hmm.
metaphysics treatise. He's with Hume, with Kant. But some people do have, the intellect, God-given intellect, to do such a project as Suarez did,
Hmm.
I believe. So I think that breaking from the traditional Aristotelian commentary method
Hmm.
was justified in his view. I don't know if you want to kind of talk a little more on that, or
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting to know, I mean, as you rightly note, right, there is this tradition of the commentary. Okay, so one of Suarez kind of contemporaries, Pedro de Fonseca, right, was known for his fantastic commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics, which follows the progression of the metaphysics, which, as we know, as a text, the metaphysics is not really a text, but a series of texts just kind of jumbled together. And so it lacks that kind of cohesion and organization that you would expect from a kind of textbook. But when you look at these Jesuits, especially in Coimbra, like Fonseca, but even Suarez himself, they're pedagogues, right? They're teachers, and so as you know, you have to organize things for your students for the sake of the science itself, and so. Um, when you look at what Fonseca was doing, interestingly, many of the questions that he begins framing within his commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics are appropriated within Suarez, but organized according to the science of metaphysics itself. So so there begins a shift there. But Suarez isn't himself, I would say, the initiator of writing these standalone textbooks, because a full 10 years before the 1597 publication of the Disputationes Metaphysicae, you have Dominican Thomas Diego Mas, who himself
right.
authors, a metaphysical disputation, right? It's not anywhere near as expansive and comprehensive as Suarez text, but nevertheless, it is its own standalone metaphysical text. And so there already seems to be some kind of movement in the direction of writing these texts, and I think it was inevitable, right? Because again, so many of these Jesuits, if you recall, this is during the time of the Ratio Studiorum for so many Jesuit universities, and it's for the sake of pedagogy, right? For teaching. So I think it was inevitable that at a certain point they were going to have to systematize metaphysics, which means moving away from a strictly kind of commentarial practice on the metaphysics. And someone like Descartes wrote his Meditations on First Philosophy as a kind of, well, let me just write my own text, as you put it. But I think there's a kind of important difference between what someone like Suarez does in the Disputationes and what someone like Kant does in his work, or any other so-called canonical modern philosophers. That Suarez himself says in the preface to the Disputationes that when we philosophize, we are always philosophizing as a Christian, right? So always with our eyes to our Christian commitment. So as Suarez, I am not bracketing out my faith commitments. I'm not prescinding from the faith or anything like that. That is always going to be informing this project. Whereas when you look at Descartes, he says, well, of course we believe, right? But we have to philosophize, says Descartes, in such a way that um, even an atheist would be compelled to agree with our conclusions. And so Descartes is willing to bracket out his faith commitments, right? And to set those aside. And so you have then not just this distinction between philosophy and theology as you had with many medieval thinkers, but a separation. So, but now to Descartes' mind, the separation was not antagonistic, but it was just a separation of these two domains of thought. As early modern philosophy would unfold, we would see that this separation did in fact become one of antagonism. So it's true to note that someone like Suarez Disputationes and Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, you can say they're standalone, but they're still very different in terms of their methodologies and their commitments, if we want to put it that way.
Right, right. I think when a lot of people read like the Summa Theologia of St. Thomas
Hmm.
Aquinas, they see kind of the emergence of a work that is not strictly metaphysical, and maybe they
Hmm.
well, there's also this mentality with Thomists that is kind of radical, like outside there's no salvation outside Thomism.
Right.
It's just like, wait, there's pluralism,
Yeah.
sound pluralism in Catholicism here, even within scholasticism, but kind of like
Hmm.
that drastic view, we can say, or sight of seeing a metaphysical work that is, and it really isn't. I mean, if when you read it, it's not, as you mentioned, it mentions the Eucharist, right?
Hmm.
It mentions other, articles of the faith that it points to, and what's really beautiful is that it draws from theology. So it's a metaphysics that, and as you pointed out, he stopped his Christological work because he was thinking, well, wait a minute, how do we properly distinguish person from nature? So really,
Hmm.
that is what, and that's why I wrote in my book his metaphysics is a modal metaphysics, but we won't
Hmm.
get into the modes. But he's worried about distinction. He's worried about that the metaphysical distinction using reason to kind of elucidate and expand on theology, but theology elucidating metaphysics, which is you don't see that relationship. I don't think intimately anywhere else where you literally uh, you stop a theological treatise and start a whole metaphysical treatise in order to
Hmm.
elucidate a theological truth, which is really fascinating. But
Hmm.
do you think Suarez would be more in the category like today, for example, well, you have the Thomists who do distinguish well between philosophy and theology, but then you have these more I don't want to say modern. They're not modernists, but they're more modern theologians. From the communio theologians, the Novel
Hmm.
theologians like de Lubac and
Hmm.
even Ratzinger,
Hmm.
that they wish to blur kind of the differences between it kind of do with the nature and supernature, philosophy and
Hmm.
theology in a sense. They wish to blur these differences and say
Hmm.
we can't strictly distinguish the two realms in a radical sense. They're
Hmm.
intertwined. I don't know where do you think
Hmm.
Science would fall in the more stronger distinction in the Thomist camp, or the more modern kind of blurring of the two
Yeah.
realms, if that makes sense.
I think probably in between both of those two camps, right? I mean, um, when you look at, as you mentioned, de Lubac, for instance, and the natural and supernatural distinction, he seems to really want to go after Suarez, right? That Suarez is kind of the boogeyman for all things that went wrong. Um, but I mean, it strikes me that to cite Maritain text, to distinguish in order to unite. It's not a kind of artificial distinction. I mean, I think it's all comes down to Christ, right? I mean, as you mentioned, Suarez interrupted his Christological work in order to compose the metaphysics, and when you look at Christ, what you have is an absolute simplicity and absolute unity, right? It's one being, but yet within that absolute simplicity of the incarnation, you do have duality, right? You have the divine nature and the human nature. And as we know, these two exist in union, but without diminishment, right? They still retain their own kind of integral natures. Human nature doesn't suddenly become divine, nor divine human, right? They both retain their own proper logics. And it seems like that's what Suarez is trying to do when he's reflecting upon our metaphysical structures of reality. They're going to retain their own proper structure, but as we know, ultimately that's going to be determined by some sort of supernatural orientation. And so I think really what Suarez is trying to do, any good theologian, I mean, this is not just unique to Suarez, but any good theologian like Scotus or Thomas, is to maintain this balance, right? You have to somehow maintain the balance of the infinite and the finite, of the supernatural with the natural, because the primary object, it seems, of any theologian is going to be this the mystery of the incarnation. It sets everything off, right? And in the incarnation, there you have this perfect balance.
That's funny because that's literally what my thesis is about. That it's seeking to synthesize using the Suarezian modes the strict distinction with Thomas of nature and supernature, and the not so clear distinction, or the blurring, if you will, of the resource
Hmm.
theology. So that's really interesting. So yeah, I totally agree. He's kind of in the
Hmm.
middle. Um,
Hmm.
would you say that Suarez, because I know you mentioned Gilles' son, Hugh's son,
Hmm.
Hugh's son, we say in Spanish, Hugh's son. It's funny. I know a lot of these French names through Spanish
Spanish, yeah,
pronunciation. So like Descartes,
sure.
Descartes. So
Oh, really? Okay.
yeah. So Gilles' son, his criticism was, and I know he did see Suarez in a more positive light, if I'm remembering correctly. But the criticism against him was that he separated St. Thomas from Aristotle,
Hmm.
uh, because he was more of an existential. Maybe he was promoting,
Hmm.
maybe not explicitly, but he was promoting more of an existentialist
Hmm.
Thomism, and a lot of people, um, and this is where the contradictions kind of come in. They accuse Suarez, even though Juleson is kind of he's positive towards Suarez. They accuse Suarez of being an essentialist, which
Hmm.
which is interesting also. So how do we is Suarez an Aristotelian? Um, and is that justified with Jules' son saying that he separates Thomas from Aristotle, and that's why ultimately he likes Suarez, because he's seeing Suarez distinguish himself from Aristotle, which he really does it in a way. So what do you think that relationship basically between Suarez and Aristotle?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? To go back to Gilson himself wants to identify a distinction between Thomas himself and Aristotle, as you note, and you find this to be a recurring theme among Gilson students like Joseph Owens and others, right? That it's precisely because Thomas has this emphasis on essay as the actus essendi, right? As you pointed out, this kind of existential dimension that really separates Thomas just from a kind of standard Aristotelianism, right? And so it's this creative metaphysics, if you will, centered upon the act of existence, that really answers to revelation, right? And to the Christian understanding of a creation ex nihilo. And so Gilson wants to celebrate this kind of existential dimension of Thomas Aquinas, but unfortunately, I think that he does this by making everyone else post Thomas a kind of essentialist, as you put it, right? So he sees Duns Scotus as an essentialist, and he sees Suarez as a kind of essentialist, and this interpretation of Gilson was extraordinarily, influential among subsequent scholars like John Doyle, for instance, but also others who also are critical of Suarez, such as Jean-François Courtine, the French scholar, and Courtine has been extraordinarily influential in a number of other scholars as well. And so the claim then, if I remember in Gilson's Being and Some Philosophers, is that Suarez begot Wolff, right? Christian Wolff,
Hmm.
and then Wolff begot Kant, right? And so there's a kind of direct line uh, between Suarez and Kant, and by the time you get to Kant, you have this transition into a kind of critical idealism that just turns philosophy on its head. And so it seems then that the essentialism that Suarez imbibed was disastrous to Gilson's mind. So that's the story Gilson tells, but I think that's not, again, quite accurate to the individual philosophers who follow after someone like Thomas Aquinas. It's not entirely accurate to someone like Duns Scotus, and not to someone like Suarez. And Gilson points out that thinkers like Scotus or Suarez are really much more inspired by Avicenna and Avicenna's doctrine of essence. And so, it's a foreordained kind of collapse into essentialism. But it's interesting. I think Gilson also says that I can never find where he says, I know I've read it, but I can never find it again, that Thomas uses uh, Aristotelian language to express decidedly non-Aristotelian concepts, right? To express a decidedly non-Aristotelian metaphysics. And I think the same can be said, something similar with respect to Suarez and Avicenna. Yes, Avicenna is extraordinarily important for someone like Suarez and Scotus, but he uses this essentialism to express something decidedly non-Avicenian, right? And if he retains then a kind of notion of essence, um, it's not an essence that is one that is denuded of any kind of existential concern. So for someone
Right.
like Suarez, he said, okay, how do we, what is metaphysics? Metaphysics is concerned with being insofar as it's real being. And so what is real being? Well, and then here Gilson will say, according to Suarez, real being is that which has a real essence. So you see, there's the essentialism. A real being is fundamentally resolved in terms of a real essence. Okay, but what does it mean to have a real essence? And as Suarez says, well, it's to have some kind of aptitude to existence. And so I can't understand what a real essence is without some kind of order to existence, right? So, yeah, to be sure, there's definitely a kind of essentialistic element within Suarez, but it's an essence that is identical with and one with, metaphysically speaking, with existence. So it's a kind of existential metaphysics unto its own. Is it the same kind that Thomas Aquinas develops? No, it's not, right?
Right.
But nevertheless, I think it is its own robust form of an existentialism that's not fairly castigated as just an essentialism that should be, thrown out the window because it somehow is associated with all the essentialistic projects of early modernity. So, I mean, I
Absolutely.
think there's a lot to be said here about that, but the categories that Gilson establishes, I think they're maybe helpful insofar as they kind of orient our way of beginning to investigate these various philosophers and thinkers. But I think at the end of the day, it's kind of overly simplistic if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And for I don't know if you heard of Father, a tremendous 20th century, 19th or 20th century Suarez, Father Jose Egin,
Yeah, yeah,
Hellin,
yeah.
tremendous. And I don't know if he has any works translated into English. I mean, I have a couple of his works
I
in
haven't found any.
Spanish. So he said he calls Suarez an integral existentialist.
Mhm.
Because essentially Suarez's whole philosophy is let reality dictate the principle, not the principle reality. And the first thing we know is not being in the abstract, but concrete being. Now,
Hmm.
this is what some people have kind of that have accused Suarez of being very much influenced by Occam, the
Hmm.
nominalist view, where Suarez seems to actually give less reality to universals. Now, this is getting really metaphysical, but again, you can't talk about Suarez, his theology.
Hmm.
We're proving his point without getting into his metaphysics, but he would say in seem he gives less existence to in one point he gives in one side he gives less existence to universals in the sense that they're not like in the Aristotelian view, universals exist individualized through the matter.
Hmm.
This is how he shows through his principle of like what makes a thing individual. It's not the matter signified by
Hmm.
the quantity, but rather the entity itself is individualized. And then this
Hmm.
is where Suarez comes, uh, the notion of essence being a physical. So he distinguishes metaphysical essence, which is in the realm of definitions. Those are universals. And then there's physical essences. So this is not Thomistic at all. Or this kind of a
Hmm.
building on Thomism, if you will, that things are individual. There's individual forms. So it's like, and this is perfect for how do you justify the individualized soul, right? So Peter
Hmm.
is individual as a physical essence, Peter, which is really interesting here, seeing how maybe nominalism come into play. I don't
Hmm.
know if you want to comment on, do you think Suarez, um, do you think there's justified accusation against Suarez that his philosophy has been very much influenced by a nominalism, maybe in a sound way, in an unsound way?
Hmm.
I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing we have to do is, I think, come to terms with what nominalism is, and so, and again, nominalism seems to be one of these terms that's, if you're a nominalist, you're, well, that's something bad, right?
Right.
And in many ways, I think what the form of nominalism, if you will, that has influenced Suarez is a kind of refined nominalism. That is to say, look, there seem to be excesses out there, right? Excesses in terms of a kind of reification of concepts, right? And
Right.
so, as you pointed out, for the Thomists, you have this matter that is going to be signified by some kind of quantity that is going to individuate things, and then Scotus is going to be even more of a kind of realist, I think, than Thomas Aquinas, because he grants that there's a certain kind of reality to common nature. And so then on top of that, you have Hexaetos. And whenever I try to teach that to the students, they just roll their eyes like, Hexaetos. What is thisness? Come on, give me a break. But I mean, to be fair to Scotus, you need something, right? You need something other than matter, other than form, to get you down to this individual. And so, I mean, the problem is that we are starting with these universals, these universal notions, and trying to get our way back down to the brute particular, right? And I think here's perhaps where nominalism has a kind of salutary dimension to it, is that, look, we all know that there are individual things. You're an individual in your office with individual beings. You're already there. And so the question then is, okay, how do I start from this individuality, this experience of brute particularity, and arrive at some kind of universal concept? So I think certainly, as you note, right, what individuates Peter is just the being of Peter. What individuates Paul is just the being of Paul. And so I think then, to that extent, we can say that Suarez is going to be influenced to a certain degree by nominalism, but it's a nominalism that I think refines our kind of our realist sensibilities, as it were. So it's not just this kind of nominalism that denies nature, so to speak, and thus throws out the natural law and then throws out moral principles and all that business. But I think it's a kind of shift to a refinement to get us away from just kind of over reification of our concepts, if you will.
Yeah, no, and that's I think that a lot of people accuse Suarez of essentialism because they see his metaphysics very abstract, but he does he
Hmm.
starts from the individual. I mean, he's
Hmm.
building up from there. So he's very much that kind of that immediate realism, and this is where
Hmm.
we get into a little bit of epistemology that Suarez does believe that, like in Thomism, the object of the intellect are the universals. The object of the senses are the singulars. But Suarez
Hmm.
kind of he says, no, the intellect can know individuals. The intellect has that intuition or that light. Maybe it's an Augustinian influence, because it seems like Saint Augustine would be closer to Suarez in epistemology, at least, that the intellect can know individuals also, because it's not, and this has a lot to do with the principle of individuation, that it's not through the
Hmm.
matter merely, but that we can kind of perceive the form individualized by the entity, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Hmm.
So yeah, maybe because I know in your article you mentioned also the univocal ontology, which Suarez
Hmm.
is accused of. And
Hmm.
so if you believe being to be univocal, basically you fall into monism, everything, and pantheism, ultimately everything in
Hmm.
God. There's no distinction between beings. So what is the distinction between being? Can you kind of elucidate that and his notion of concepts? Because again, with the notion of essentialism, and I believe this is related. His definition of being is what exists and what can exist, right?
Okay.
And the reason I mention that is because kind of the notion of concepts. Well, if we could jump to concepts, it's hard because Suarez philosophy is like a web, so it's kind of hard sometimes.
Hmm. Hmm.
But the notion of concepts, I believe he talks about a formal concept and an
Hmm.
objective concept. Can you talk about that and how that relates with
Sure.
his univocal ontology? Would you say that Suarez's his metaphysics is promotes univocity, or it in what sense does it, or what do you?
No, I wouldn't say that it does. He's quite explicitly clear that being, the concept of being is analogical, right? So here I just mentioned the concept of being, and as you rightly note, for Suarez, there's this distinction between the formal and the objective concept. So there's a number of things, as you know, Suarez is like a web, right? There's a number of things coming together here. Immediately after the first disputation, where he establishes that being, insofar as its real being, is the subject matter of metaphysics, then he turns to an investigation of the concept of being. And so the question here then, okay, why is he shifting to this concept? Is this, I mean, when you think of a concept, you think of something instrumental, right? I mean, you have a concept of your friend, the concept of your family, and so on and so forth. Um, but as you pointed out rightly, and this is not something that Suarez himself generated. He says it's a common distinction by his time, the formal concept and the objective concept. And so he says the formal concept is just that act of the intellect, right, intending towards something. And so if you are right now thinking of a giraffe, right, it's your act of thinking right now that is the formal concept. And so what terminates that concept? What's the object of that formal concept? Well, it's the objective concept, right? And that's where things get a little funky, okay? Because what is an objective concept? He says, well, it's that thing that you're thinking about. Okay, so if you're thinking about a real being, the objective concept is a real being. If you're thinking of a privation, of a negation, of a fiction, then the objective concept is a privation, negation, or a fiction. Okay. So the question we have to ask ourselves then, well, with what objective concept is metaphysics concerned? And he says, metaphysics is concerned with the objective concept of being, right? And so he's not saying here then that metaphysics is concerned with intramental properties or anything like that. An objective concept in this sense, he says, not really a concept at all, except by extrinsic denomination, right? So that's the first thing that we have to note here is that the objective concept of being is not something intramental, right? It's something extramental. It's what we are encountering. Okay. So what then how do we understand this objective concept of being? And he says, well, um, I can understand things insofar as they have, as he says, some kind of agreement in being and agreement in existing. And so, I think of diverse entities, a cat, a dog, a tree, a human being, whatever. And each of these has a radically distinct kind of nature. And they're irreducibly distinct, but nevertheless, I can grasp each of these things insofar as they have some kind of metaphysical agreement in being, in esse, as he says. And so I can form then this objective concept of being that considers not kinds of beings, but just the community of being in reference to existence. Okay, so then I have one objective concept of being, and it's absolutely simple. And so does that mean then that the objective concept of being is univocal? And so there's this one important kind of infamous passage in the second disputation, the second section, paragraph 36, where Suarez says, if I have to deny the unity of the concept of being or analogy, then I'll have to deny analogy and retain the unity of the concept of being, which is demonstrated by more certain reasons, right? And everyone will cite that. Everyone who wants to accuse Suarez of advancing univocity, and they'll stop there. But if you continue with that path, she says, but in actual reality, I don't need to reject either. I don't need to reject univocity or, sorry, I don't need to reject the unity of the concept of being or analogy. And I can maintain these both. And the question then is, well, how can you maintain the unity of the concept of being and an analogy? And in the 28th disputation, he tells us this, that being itself, however abstractly it might be conceived, being of itself demands this order, he says, that first and foremost, that it's going to pertain to God, who is just, ipsum esse, to use the Thomistic phraseology, or infinite being. It's going to pertain first to God, and then derivatively to everything else, to all other creatures. So you have then within the structure of being, if you will, this kind of priority and posteriority. You have this inner inequality, if you will. And so that's sufficient, as Suarez sees it, to render it analogical. That is to say, you're not just going to encounter just this kind of abstract notion of existence out there. You're always going to find it instantiated, if you will, in various degrees, right? So there's not just existence, there's the existence of the infinite being, God. There's not just existence, there's the existence of the finite being, the creature, or there's the existence of a substance or the existence of an accident, right? And so there is then this kind of inner inequality within the concept of being that renders it analogical. So I don't think then that Suarez is developing a kind of univocal ontology, despite the fact that many others would want to say that. But that said, after Suarez, there's a kind of turn to univocity when you think of Jesuits like Rodrigo Arriaga or Richard Lynch. There is definitely a kind of turn to univocity. And when they want to argue for univocity, I think it's very telling that they have to react to Suarez because they know he's championing analogy. So his immediate successors, recognize that Suarez is a champion of analogy. They want to go down the route of univocity, so they have to take him seriously on that count.
Right, I was reminded when you were saying that. I mean, really, the Thomists, in a sense, are essentialists, in the sense that they believe in being existing in the abstract, in the as
Hmm.
universal. Where Suarez says, and it came to me right towards what you said, towards the latter part, that being in the very definition of being is the individual. It's individualized. So it
Hmm.
is individual being. It does not
Hmm.
exist as a universal. So,
Right.
but being prescinding, so as you say, being prescinding, I think that's an English word, prescinding, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Prescinding from all's particularities. And
Hmm.
the very first division, as you would mention, would be, and this is where one of the fundamental differences between Thomism also and Suarism is that is God be necessary being and or unnecessary being or being that participates, being that exists in itself. We can say, well,
Hmm.
that would rather be substance, but really this fundamental distinction between God and the creatures from
Hmm.
being prescinding from all particularities uh, would be one, right, in this concept, of course. But once you apply it, obviously it is analogically applied. I do want to get to this last metaphysical part before turning to your conclusion. in the theological orientation is that what do you make of about the Thomistic? And I think again, I think it's more of a difference of terminology than of content. Of when they say, "Oh,
Hmm.
Suarez identifies in creatures, independent beings, the essence with the existence." So, like we are existence. We are our existence. Like in the sense
Hmm.
that Thomists say, no, there's a real distinction
Hmm.
between essence and existence in creatures, and that's the fundamental difference between God and creatures. And in God, existence and essence identify. They're identified.
Hmm.
God's very definition is to exist. So my definition, if you will, is not to exist. I just have
Hmm.
a borrowed existence. So
Hmm.
how do we, because that's very was fundamental here, and
Hmm.
that's more of Thomistic metaphysicians. That's what they attack Suarez on, this lack
Right.
of real distinction between existence and essence in
Right.
creatures.
So as you note, I mean, the terminology real distinction is somewhat ambiguous. I mean, Thomas himself doesn't use it, but certainly later Thomists do.
Mhm.
And you're right to note that the intuition here is that if somehow I am identical with my own existence, and it seems like I'm God, right?
Right.
That I have my own existence, and so therefore I'm God. I think it's interesting to note then that in the 31st disputation, where Suarez takes up this issue of the relationship between essence and existence, the reason why he identifies essence with existence and only introduces a rational distinction as opposed to a real distinction or a formal modal distinction is on a Christological basis, right? That if I say that there's a real distinction between essence and existence, then when Christ assumed a human nature, which is a human essence without any existence, he's not really assuming our human reality, says Suarez, right? What is it to be a human? To be a human is to not just to have this nature, right, this human nature, but to exist as a human. And so Suarez then decides upon his metaphysical thesis on the basis of a kind of Christological insight, right? And so again, this to go back to your set of questions at the very beginning with respect to the relationship between theology and metaphysics. Here you have precisely one of these moments where it's the theology informing Suarez's metaphysical conclusion. So then, okay, if that's the case, how am I not God? If my essence is identical with my active existence, how am I not God? Well, I think what Suarez would say is, okay, um, it's not the case that you have an essence standing out there and an existence apart from it. No, what is our experience? Our experience is always of beings, the Latin ens, right? E-N-S, or the plural ensia. That's what exists. And so, um, essence and existence then seem to be principles responsible for producing somehow being. And then the question is going to be, well, what's the metaphysical status of these principles? If you want to say that they're really distinct, that's where you start getting problems, right? Because if they're really distinct, then okay, they might not be beings unto themselves, but they're going to have some kind of metaphysical reality unto themselves. And going all the way back then to someone like Henry of Ghent, and you start attributing a kind of a being to essence and a being to existence, right? You get the famous notions of esse essentiae, esse existentiae, right? And now you've got problems because you have an essential being that is somehow distinct from existence. And so, does it depend upon God or does it not? And to go back to the 31st disputation, where Suarez is arguing his point that there's only a rational distinction between essence and existence, he notes that, well, someone like Capriolus, right, the Prince of Thomas, says that creatures enjoy their esse existentiae from God, but not their esse essentiae, not their essential being. And Suarez thinks this is outrageous because now basically what you have here is some kind of reality, esse essentiae. You have some kind of reality that does not depend upon God whatsoever. And obviously, this is going to be a huge problem if you're a Christian theologian committed to a notion of, creation ex nihilo, and you're going to have something out there that enjoys its own kind of non-existential but essential reality independent from God. No, that's a problem. And so for Suarez, then what he's going to say is, look, essence and existence are identical. They're rationally distinct. But here's the thing. What am I? I'm fundamentally a being. And what kind of a being am I? I'm a ens ab alio, right? I'm a being from another. And so that's sufficient to explain then how I'm not God, because God is being ase, he's being from himself. And though my existence is identical with my essence, right? It's still the case that that existence doesn't derive from me. It derives from God as in the creative act. And so I'm an ens ab alio. God is an ens ase, and that enough right there is sufficient to mark the distinction between saying, well, yeah, I might have my own existence, but I'm not God because I'm still a dependent being.
Yeah. No, and it definitely goes back to the distinction to also metaphysical and physical essence. So ours would agree that we are not our physical essences. Like I am not humanity, and as you alluded
Hmm.
to, it's revealed in Christology. I am my physical essence. So it's yeah, which physically exists. So they have to exist concomitantly, like they have to
Hmm.
coexist. So it's not
Hmm.
like the act. I think the problem with atomism in the sense that it applies the potency and act to everything. Like it's just
Hmm.
potency act. So it's really you're activating, and it is applied in existence and essence, that the essence is
Hmm.
somehow in potency, but it's
Hmm.
okay, it's in potency, but it's like um how does it doesn't exist, so it
No, no,
doesn't
right,
have existence, but it in a sense it does. So
right.
it's very confusing, but no, it's again, I think we're seeing the even again, even though it's deeper and it could be more difficult to understand, we're seeing the stronger realism, if you will, in Suarez. Again, based on stemming from theology. I did
Hmm.
want to ask you because, and then we could kind of start wrapping it up here. So modern philosophy, a lot of people say, well, because it stems from Protestantism. A lot of the modern philosophers were Protestants, and that's
Hmm.
true. Because kind of this subjectivization of philosophy,
Hmm.
which actually influenced a lot of the philosophers to produce their own kind of metaphysical treatise or what have you. But
Hmm.
Descartes was a Jesuit. So a lot of people were saying, well, he was a Jesuit, so he obviously had to be influenced by Suarez, Descartes. But do you know, but where's there a break with Descartes? Did he malinterpret Suarez? Was there another work that he kind of that deviated him from the neo-scholasticism of the Jesuit school? Or did he kind of, I mean, what happened to him that he kind of went off this tremendous philosophical rail, we can say, deviated totally.
Hmm. So, I mean, Descartes was not himself a Jesuit, but he was taught by the Jesuits, right? He's a student of the Jesuits at La Flèche. And this is a point of significant scholarly controversy, just to who are his sources, who was influencing him. And as we know in the Meditations on First Philosophy, he writes this prefatory letter to the Jesuits at the Sorbonne, right? He wants them basically to offer their protection to him because he is developing a new kind of philosophical attitude, one that is non-Aristotelian, and so aware of what is happening to innovators such as Galileo, right? He wants to make sure that his own thought is going to be safeguarded. It's difficult to say just exactly who's influencing Descartes because he writes in his letters especially, right? He's kind of back and forth. He says, oh, I owe everything to the Society of Jesus. The Society of Jesus taught me so much. I owe everything, right? But then to
Mhm.
another person, or I can't even remember any of these Jesuits, right? He says, I only remember Antonio Rubio and Toledo's, right? Francisco de Toledo. Those are the only ones I remember. And so certainly those two would have been influential insofar as they authored text, logical text that would have been used at La Flèche. In Descartes' responses to various objections, especially with respect to material falsity, he does cite Suarez, so he seems to be at least familiar with Suarez.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know how great of a knowledge Descartes would have enjoyed of Suarez or even of many of these other scholastics. And from what I understand, when he was trying to learn scholastic metaphysics, kind of to develop his own thought and to respond to it, it was more a Eustace of St. Paul and his works that were influential to someone like Descartes, right? So. Um, I think then it is with someone such as Descartes that you have this kind of radical shift, if you will, right? Insofar as he has abandoned the kind of Aristotelian epistemology. And I think what we can say is, broadly speaking, all of these scholastics were, I mean, of course, they're very different, right? But broadly speaking, they cohere in this kind of fundamental Aristotelian epistemological orientation. Descartes abandons that, right? Um, and then the question is, okay, what are we going to start with? We'll start with thought. We'll start with the mind, and then we'll go from there. And obviously that's going to have its problems. And it's interesting, my students will ask me, what did the Jesuits think about this? Because I mean, Descartes, as we know, I mean, most of these, as Gilson points out, most of these early modern philosophers were just armchair philosophers, right? They weren't professionals. The professional philosophers at the time were your scholastics, right? Your Jesuits or your Dominicans teaching at the universities. Those were your professionals. And Descartes was really just kind of an armchair philosopher. And so the students will ask me sometimes, well, what did the Jesuits think about this? Not a whole lot. They didn't take him seriously, right? And you have some Jesuits like Thomas Compton Carleton who will critique Descartes, but really a lot of them, it seems, didn't take his thought too seriously. And Descartes was much more influential, so it seems, in your kind of popular audience, because here he's writing in French and as well as Latin. So I think it's with someone like Descartes then who shifts philosophy, but it's not because of what he learned from the Society of Jesus or even from someone like Suarez.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. A lot of these modern philosophers, I mean, they're they don't get into depth and their substance is totally lacking compared to the scholastic philosophers. So it's easy in a sense to not take them seriously because first of all,
Hmm.
Descartes was a mathematician
Hmm.
and his philosophy is not that. I mean, the consequences of it, I think the Cartesians kind of they deduce other things, if you will, from his philosophy, but he really doesn't
Hmm.
go besides the consequence, their profound consequences, but
Hmm.
doesn't go into depth at all, like a Suarez would, or even the other neo-scholastics of lesser name, if you will. So modern philosophers, Hume, for example, these are really small players, if you will. They're not
Hmm.
definitely not in the big leagues, not even in the minor leagues in
Hmm.
philosophy, in my view. So yeah, it is easy in a sense to not take them serious. But yeah, so this has been great. We definitely we want to stress here that you really to know Suarez, you have to know both his theology and philosophy because they're so interrelated. They're so interrelated.
Hmm.
As you mentioned in your article, his metaphysics is a Christological metaphysics. It is
Hmm.
inspired on his Christology, especially on the incarnation. Actually, that's the name of the work he was working on when he shifted
Hmm.
to his metaphysical work. And the main mystery of a Christian faith, the hypostatic union, really impelled him to start a metaphysical work. So really, I, how would you recommend? And I'll give you the last word here, and any exhortations on Suarez. What would you recommend? Because sometimes just jumping into the metaphysical disputations can be difficult. I'm rereading, especially in English. Um, for the English speakers, I'm reading the second disputation, which is on the concept of being, and it's hard to understand in English. In English is hard to
Hmm.
understand. What would you recommend for people who want to people who are just of the average mindset who want to know Suarez because we are seeing a growing interest in the English speaking world of Suarez, maybe more his theology, but again, his theology and metaphysics go hand in hand.
Hmm.
How would you or what advice can you give to people who have that interest?
Yeah, first of all, as you said, learn Latin, right? Because it's difficult to make sense of what he's doing in English, right? So Having a sufficient command of Latin is always a good thing. But you're right, it's very difficult, right? Because it's kind of like walking in the middle of a conversation. It's like, what are you talking? You guys are going back and forth. What are we talking about here, right? And in many ways, this is kind of what's happening with Suarez because he is in conversation with the tradition, right? The tradition of your Thomists, your Scotus, your nominalists, all kinds of others. And so it's really difficult to appreciate what Suarez is up to without understanding of what these other kind of schools are doing. So I think it would certainly help to kind of have a general familiarity of what, the main problems and philosophical agendas, if you will, of your schools, like your Thomists, your Scotus, so on and so forth. But then after that, just, you know, bit by bit, they say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? And when you look at the Disputationes Metaphysicae, it's like a textual elephant right there, if you will. There's no easy way to go about doing it. It's just you have to sit down and work your way through it. And if there's something that is opaque and it's not entirely clear, then that's when you have to do your historical research and say, okay, what were the Thomists talking about here? Or what were the Scotus talking about here? And go back and fill in the blanks, so to speak. But it's definitely a task that's not a simple one.
Yes, sure. Yeah. I think that's great. Make time because a lot of I think we waste a lot of time in the news, which the news is fascinating,
Oh
especially
yeah.
theatrical news, fascinating what's going on here. But because of social media, the internet, we could definitely be easily distracted
Hmm.
from delving into these deep realities that help us to explicate and to live our faith. So definitely I commend everyone to delve into the mysteries of our faith, delve into metaphysics. You cannot be a theologian without being a metaphysician. And little by little, as Dr. Salas said, to eat elephants one bite at a time. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Salas, for coming on. Maybe we can have a
Thank
future
you.
video. I know you're a super busy man, but I appreciate it. And thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much.